I don't want to summarize recent events in China because there are people here who can more adequately do that than I do want to put it in a larger perspective, however, because it seems to me that the aborted Jasmine Revolution is only the latest chapter in Beijing's long and increasingly sophisticated campaign to quell all manner of dissent and to control all important aspects of civil society. You know, it's not surprising that Chinese dissidents sought to follow in the footsteps of democratic activists in Tunisia and Egypt. But the Chinese government was way ahead of them. It preempted their actions at every stage. On Saturday, for example, February 19th, the organizers of peaceful demonstrations in China announced a very specific plan for demonstrations the following day, February 20th. But even 10 days before that, Chinese President Hu Jintao, as the commander-in-chief of the PLA and the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, had already issued a directive to the military to be prepared for contingencies. This is well in advance of any call for peaceful demonstrations. The directive issued on February 10th specifically instructed party cells within the military to study a document called Regulation Governing the Works of the Party Committees in the Military, whose purpose was to strengthen the party's control of the military. The explanatory note that came along with this regulation said that each one of the 33 articles centers on ensuring the absolute control of the party over the military. You can understand why a one-party dictatorship would be concerned that in the event of peaceful demonstrations, the military would be absolutely obedient to its dictates. In fact, the document goes on to remind the military that all of its members owe their allegiance first and foremost to the party, then to the socialism, then to the state, and finally, and only lastly, to the people. So if the party finds itself in a confrontation with the people, this prioritization intimates the military is to support the party at all costs. We know what that meant in Tiananmen some 20-odd years ago. And then on February 19th, the same day the dissidents first issued a detailed plan for peaceful demonstrations in 13 cities, Hu Jintao held a meeting of top officials to combat the perceived threat of unrest. According to the Xinhua news agency, the meeting not only included all 9 members of the CCP's powerful Politburo Standing Committee, it also included provincial heads, ministry chiefs, and senior military officials. Such a high-level meeting could not possibly have been convened overnight. Obviously, this was in planning for a long time, suggesting again the preemptive nature of the Chinese government's response to the upheavals in the Arab world and their possible spread to China. In his surprisingly blunt address, Hu Jintao stressed that the Communist Party must strengthen its management of society in order to stay in power. Now, the management of society is a phrase that I haven't heard before. Chairman Mao Zedong, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, always talked about serving the people. Now Hu Jintao is talking about managing the people. This formulation marks a major departure from standard communist rhetoric. The purpose of this societal management, according to Hu, is to, quote, maximize harmonious factors and minimize non-harmonious ones. In other words, those who adhere to the party line are to be encouraged, while those who depart from it are to be crushed. I suppose there are many, quote-unquote, non-harmonious factors languishing in jail as we speak today, being minimized, sometimes unto death. The following day, in fact, the very day slated for the first peaceful demonstrations, the Politburo member in charge of national public security weighed in. Zhou Yongkang called upon the party not just to serve the people, but to manage the people as well, and announced specific ways in which this new management scrutiny would be carried out. He announced a national database containing information on everyone in the country, including specific groups of people, which is code for people who are religious, minorities, other people, political dissidents, other people who questioned the party's actions in any way. Second, with strong leadership from the party, cyberspace was to be brought under even stricter government control with strict enforcement of anti-sedition laws. Third, foreign non-governmental organizations in China will now be subjected to a, quote, dual system of supervision, end of quote. And I think this speaks to all girls aloud problems in China, where they are now being supervised out of business, in effect. This can only mean that all of these organizations, even foreign organizations that are simply there to do charitable work and have no interest in politics whatsoever, will be subject to heightened scrutiny by several different Chinese government agencies and perhaps closed down. Fourth, an early warning system will be put in place to alert the authorities to social grievances so as to allow them to defuse problems before they deteriorate into outright social unrest. Now, I would point out here that none of this is really new. It's an elaboration, it's a deepening of what has gone before. I mean, the Ministry of State Security in China has already compiled extensive files on Chinese who've been questioned, who in the past have questioned this or that government policy. The monitoring and control of the Internet has been growing for years. Foreign organizations have always been viewed with suspicion, and Chinese citizens have always been monitored by party-run social monitoring networks. But the amount of resources, the amount of money going into these actions is increasing at an enormous rate. Big Brother in China is getting ever bigger, not as we hoped 20 years ago, ever smaller as civil society grew. You know, even by the time of the Olympic Games in 2008, we saw a 5-tiered social monitoring network. It included camera surveillance in public areas. It included internet surveillance, regular police patrols on the streets, monitoring by peers in the workplace, monitoring by neighborhood committees. But of course, this wasn't created in 2008 for the Olympics. Some of these things had existed from the founding of the People's Republic of China. The neighborhood committees, for example, reporting on your fellow workers in the workforce. This is not an overreaction on the part of the regime to the so-called Jasmine Revolution. This is a misinterpretation of what happened. The government wasn't reacting to events at all. It was anticipating them. All of its actions were taken in advance of any major public demonstrations and are more properly characterized as a kind of preemptive suppression. Now, we in the Population Research Institute have carried out investigations in China over the years, as you know, Mr. Chairman, and I wanted to talk about a couple of things that have come to light in our recent visits to China. Well in advance of any unrest in the Arab world, the Chinese government was tightening controls on civil society, especially in the last year or two. Two examples. The intensifying persecution of Christians is one. As some of you may know, the Chinese government has now reasserted control over the Catholic Church in China and has installed an illicit bishop as the head of the church organization run by the Chinese government in China. It has also actually put a man, Ma Yinglin, who has been excommunicated by the Vatican as a head of the Catholic Bishop Conference in China, so that now an official non-Catholic is in charge of the Catholic bishops in China. I don't think you get more heavy-handed than that. And that violates the unspoken Concordat that we saw between the Vatican and the People's Republic of China over the last several years, in a way that it probably means there's no going back. We also looked into the one-child policy on our recent visits to China, and we've already heard some heart-wrenching stories today about particular instances of that. Our investigation was focused on what are called model birth county programs, which are run by the UN Population Fund. We have visited, over the last many months, 6 different counties which were identified by the United Nations Population Fund as model birth control counties, where the UNFPA told us that targets and quotas had been lifted, that women were free to voluntarily select the timing and spacing of their pregnancies, and that abortion is not promoted as a method of family planning. Now, we found in those counties all the abuses that you mentioned in your opening remarks and that have been brought up here on a couple of occasions already. But let me just speak to a couple of points that haven't come up yet. We visited Fengning Autonomous Manchu County in northern Hebei province. That's a county right near the border with what we used to call Manchuria, and it's a UN Population Fund model birth control county. Many of its residents are of Manchu descent, hence its designation as a Manchu Autonomous County. Now, from the beginning of the one-child policy, the Chinese government has maintained that the policy does not apply to minorities, like the Manchus, like the Uyghurs, like the Tibetans. In fact, and the UNFPA, of course, has repeated those claims on many occasions. We interviewed a number of Manchus who assured us that the one-child policy was being just as rigorously enforced on them, this minority, in this UN Population Fund model birth control county. It was being enforced in the same way with targets and quotas and coercive sterilizations and, if need be, coercive abortions than it was being enforced everywhere else. So the Chinese government's claim that all minorities are exempt from the one-child policy, which the UNFPA has at various times repeated, seems simply not to be true, at least in this county. The other thing I'd like to talk about in conclusion is child abduction, child trafficking, and the one-child policy. We visited a county in northern Guangxi province, Lipu County, which is not very far from the border with Hunan province to the north. This is another UN Population Fund model birth control county. And we were told by local officials, quote, that at the present time, if you don't pay the fine for having an illegal child, they come and abduct the baby you just gave birth to, and then they give it to someone else. Now, we have all just read in the last couple of weeks that this practice of child abduction has been reported in the Caixin Century magazine, where authorities in the southern province of Hunan, just north of where we conducted our investigation, are looking into a report that population control officials seized 16 babies born in violation of strict family planning rules, sent them to state-run orphanages, which then in turn sold them abroad for adoption. And they quoted an individual saying, before 1997, they usually punished us by tearing down our houses for breaching the one-child policy, but after 2000, they began to confiscate our children. Now, this is the same kind of thing that we found, Mr. Chairman, that they're not tearing down homes so much as collecting huge fines from parents, and if they can't pay the fine, then the babies are taken away, abducted. The orphanage pays the population control officials a couple thousand renminbi for each child, and then, of course, they in turn collect $3,000 to $5,000 for each child adopted overseas, money that is paid by the adoptive parents. You know, it's worth noting that these two reports, our report and the report from China, came from the same general area of China and occurred in neighboring provinces. Local officials, of course, have denied that they abduct children. They deny that they traffic in babies. But it is well known that China's job responsibility system, quote unquote, requires them to rigorously enforce the one-child policy, and that their success or failure in this area determines future promotions or demotions. Abducting and selling an illegal child or baby would not only enable an official to eliminate a potential black mark on his record, it will allow him to make a profit at the same time. In this way, the one-child policy, through its system of perverse and inhumane rewards and punishments, rewards officials for violating the fundamental rights of parents to decide for themselves the number and spacing of their children. Child trafficking has occurred in other countries that offer children for adoption, in Cambodia, Nepal, and Vietnam, where the abuses are so rampant that the U.S. has put a moratorium on adoptions. I have always encouraged adoptions from China, arguing that every baby adopted from China is a life saved. But, Mr. Chairman, it may be time to consider a similar moratorium on adoptions from China. Thank you.